Hey, Tim Frisch with a fresh perspective, bringing you analysis, reviews, and fun from a Christian nerd's point of view. And today I'm going to be talking about a conversation that I saw that came out just a few days ago on the Legacy Standard Bible. This was a conversation with Dr. John MacArthur and Dr. Abner Chou. And the Legacy Standard Bible, I've talked about this before, and it is a topic of great interest to many people who are interested in Bible translation, and especially those who follow Dr. John MacArthur, maybe people who use the New American Standard Bible. And he talks in this video about his appreciation for the New American Standard Bible and how he has used it throughout his entire ministry. He's been teaching and preaching for 50 years or more, and he has used the NASB throughout that entire time. That's incredible. But it's fascinating because as a legacy that I think is a legacy to the New American Standard Bible, but also to his teaching ministry, he is going to be with the Master's Seminary and University bringing out this unique edition of the New American Standard Bible called the Legacy Standard Bible. And I'll just play the beginning of this video. I would love to talk more about the entire conversation, so I'll probably do some upcoming videos where I talk more about this in detail. But just to kind of give you the initial impressions, I'd like to show you the beginning of this video.
The Bible, if you want a real Bible, has to be a word-for-word translation, as close as you can get to the original Hebrew and the original Greek. The trend these days is to update everything, to retranslate. Translation comes out 5 or 10 years later, they want to update it, they want to do it again, they want to catch up to the language. They chase the culture a little bit, chase the changes in vernacular. Because the Bible never changes, if you have an accurate translation of the Bible, it doesn't need to change, it doesn't need to be updated. It doesn't need to accommodate the culture. What happens in the culture doesn't affect the eternal Word of God. And I think it's important to preserve that. I think this translation is good for another half a century. I don't think we need to think about redoing translation. But having said that, while this is the most accurate, I think we have the opportunity to go back to it and go through it word by word, through the Hebrew, through the Greek, in the original, and make it even better.
So it's really interesting how he talks here about how the Bible doesn't need to be changed. And I understand where he's coming from. There's so many updates to different Bible translations. And so he's really kind of speaking on the other side there, talking about how we don't need to update the Bible all the time. So the Legacy Standard Bible, he says, could be in its present form for a half century, 50 years without needing to be updated. But it's interesting how he talks about the Bible not needing to be changed, but then he goes on to say that they're going to essentially change the New American Standard Bible in some ways. And so, a question there is, well, why is it okay for them to make these changes but not other people? And that's a thought that popped into my head. However, I will say, kind of from their perspective, that I think a couple things allow them to make the changes that they're making in order to create the Legacy Standard Bible. And the first is the type of changes that they're making. They're not making changes to try to accommodate culture. They're really making changes to reflect the original languages of the Bible more. So that's the type of changes they're making in the Legacy Standard Bible. The other thing would be the frequency of changes. Other Bibles, and this is the point he's making, are being updated quite often. At least from his perspective, they're being updated too often. And so he feels that you just don't need to be making constant updates to Bible translations. And I know a lot of you agree with that. I resonate with that a lot. I grew up using the King James Version, which, it went through some updates, but essentially was the same translation for hundreds of years, and I used that growing up. So, how often do we need to be updating translations? Does it really need to be every 5-10 years? So the frequency of the changes is the other issue. Yeah, they're going to change the New American Standard Bible, but then they're going to leave it alone. At least that's what they're planning. When they make the Legacy Standard Bible, it's not going to be changed for quite some time. So those are some initial things about this video, but I thought I would give some reaction to this. And like I said, I'll try to probably do other videos that examine this conversation in more detail, because it's really a fascinating conversation and interesting topic to think about the Legacy Standard Bible and why MacArthur and Masters Seminary is producing this translation. And my first reaction is I do understand why they would want to do this. One, because there is really a desire, I think, for stability. When it comes to translation, there's just so many updates being done. There's so many translations out there. It can be a little much for people. And I think in order to create more stability, and with all the cultural changes that take place too, we have a desire for something that's just not going to be changing constantly. And so I think there's a desire for stability here. Also a legacy. It's called the Legacy Standard Bible. And especially I could tell in this video that this is really just, I think, something MacArthur really wanted to do and feels privileged to do, to kind of pass something on as he comes to the end of his ministry. At some point, he's not going to live forever, and he is getting older. He wants to be able to have a legacy of his teaching and preaching ministry, and I think that this translation is part of that legacy. So those are just some things about this translation. And I will say, I do have mixed reactions. I mean, I think those are good things. And I think it will also be good to have a translation that is not updated often. There's just so many translations out there, and they're being updated a lot. So I understand the desire to have something that's not changing. I use the New King James Version a lot myself. I mentioned I used the King James growing up, so I'm kind of that mindset that you don't need to be updating all the time. But with that said, I think a question for me is, even though there's a desire to not update, eventually there does come a time when a translation starts to become obsolete or out of place linguistically. And so the question is, what is going to happen with the Legacy Standard Bible in 50 years from now? Now, I know that's not what we're thinking about right now, but, in 50 years, I'll be 90, so maybe I'll do a video on it then, and it'll be interesting to see if I'm still alive, what's going to happen with the Legacy Standard Bible in 50 years. So what I'm saying, though, is that even though there's a desire to create stability and not update, I think that's good. There's still going to come a point, even with this translation, where it will need to be updated. I'm really curious, honestly, in 50 years, are there going to be people that are like, no, don't change the Legacy Standard Bible. We've used it for 50 years. Don't change it. We don't like the changes you're making. Is there going to be a new Legacy Standard Bible someday, an NLSB? Some of us maybe we'll live long enough to see that day. I don't know. But it's just an interesting thing to think about. But I do have a concern when it comes to this translation. I've voiced this before, and I still have some concerns about it. But one concern for me is that superiority complex that I think can happen. And this can happen with different translations, where we think, my translation is the best. It's so good and better than all other translations. And it can kind of create a superiority complex about it. And, with this Legacy Standard Bible, people that use it could say, well, it's word for word and it doesn't update all the time. And the phrase that they use, and I want to talk more about this in an upcoming video, chasing the culture. We don't chase the culture. This translation translates more consistently and accurately than other translations. And so the net effect of that is, you're kind of essentially saying our translation is the best. And the unintended effect of that, I think, it's not the intention, but the effect can be kind of a sectarian effect, right? Where we start to say, well, if you're using this Bible and you're taking this approach, then you're better than other Christians who take a different approach. I know that's never the intention, but that can be the unintended effect. And so that's a concern with this. But I will say, when you look at the overall translation market and the translation trends that are out there, one thing I do like about the Legacy Standard Bible is I think that it's going to help pull the Bible translation trends in a certain direction. And, because John MacArthur does have influence, I mean, let's face it, he is a really well-known teacher, highly respected. For his seminary and university masters to be putting out this translation, I do think it will help the overall translation trend. I believe other translations are being updated a lot, and maybe this will help them to just reconsider, do we need to update so much? Because this is going to cultivate, I think, and reinforce in people a desire to have a translation that isn't updated so much. So that could be good, to try to pull the translation trend back a little bit more towards stability. And it's also helpful too, I think, because they're pulling away from this constant desire to be culturally relevant and up to date. And yeah, there is a side of that we need to think about, because translation is speaking into our culture, into our language. But this Bible, the Legacy Standard, is trying to pull more toward the side of getting the modern reader into the biblical language and mindset. And so I think that's good too. And so I think it could just, in the overall landscape, pull the Bible translation trend, in a way that is good. It balances things out. So it's not necessarily a translation I will use a lot, although I'm sure I will have one and use it for study purposes, have it on my shelf. But I don't think it would be my main translation. And there are, like I said, things that I'm not necessarily super excited about with it in terms of the way that they're presenting it, or the way that people might take it as being a superior translation. But I do think it could have an overall good effect in the Bible translation world of just maintaining a balance. I will say in all this too, John MacArthur, he's a word-for-word guy when it comes to translation, and this video brings that out. He believes in word-for-word translation. So we can talk more about that, but I will say other translators would make the argument that it's actually more accurate for readers today when you take a more dynamic approach, because you're going to actually convey certain things more clearly and accurately in our language if you're not overly rigid about following the original language. So that's a debate, and I've talked about literal versus dynamic translation. You can check that video out. Those are some of my initial thoughts on this, but I would love to hear what you think about the Legacy Standard Bible. And as always, thank you for listening to my thoughts brought to you from a fresh perspective.